For Macha, it was a day of happiness. Since she had been a small child of 4, she had lived as foster child according to the Irish custom in the household of her father's kinsman, Sisnan, and his wife, Finola, sharing through the long years the days and pastimes of her 2 foster sisters and their brother, Benet. Today, on this bright day in the spring season of the year 432, her foster father had called her to him in the cool early shadows of his hall, where the damp smoke of the fresh kindled fire still crept up about the rafters, and the sun had not yet struck in through the open door. He saw her surprised expression as she looked about the almost empty hall, the curtains still drawn against the sleeping rooms along the walls, and her foster father alone, without the company that should attend him always in his hall, according to his position as chieftain of a tribe. "Yes, my daughter," he said, as he bent to take the kisses of her salutation on his cheek. "We are alone, and I have wished it so, because I have very important news for you this morning, and I wanted you to hear it from me in quietness." She looked at him watchfully. "Yes, my father?" Under the smooth, curled locks of his graying hair, his gentle face was mild and sad. He was a man considerably older than her father, known through all the eastern land for his quietness and wisdom. "So many years," he said to her, and smiled, warm with affection. "So many years we have had you, since your feet were small for stumbling up the long slopes of the dun, and you were weightless on my back if I should carry you. But now, Macha, our daughter, you are near to 14 years, and it is time for us to part with you, to send you back to your father's house, so that he and your mother may think of your marriage and prepare you for it. You are to go home." "To go home?" The girl started at him, and fear and delight struggled together across her soft, freckled face. In the first confused rush of her feelings, she looked about her and was glad of the kindness that had led him to tell her alone. "To go home," she said again. "To Tara," she added, then, on a soft breath of wonder and disbelief. In the long years in the household of Sisnan, she had been truly happy, taking for granted the custom of her fosterage, but she knew that she was the daughter of Lebron of the long memory, chief judge of Leary, the high king of Erin, and under all her happiness was the knowledge that one day she would go back to her father's house on the green slopes of the sacred hill of Tara, below the dwelling of the king. For a long moment she said nothing, all her mixed feelings surging in her mind. "Are you not pleased?" Sisnan asked her, then, looking at her with gentle concern and lifting his voice a little against the clatter of the bondwomen who tended the smoking fire. Since the message had come to him in the dawn, bidding the girl to be returned to her parents, he had been thinking of her, wondering how she would face the change. He knew she was devoted to his family and his wife, Finola, and had feared for grief and dismay. To his relief, the face she turned up to him was nothing more than a little fearful and touched with excitement. "Sisnan, my father," she said. Her voice was breathless, a small voice at all times, and light. "I am sad to leave you after all these long years, when my growing feet have walked your house." She had got the formal words out, and now she rushed on. "But you and the family will visit with us in Tara, as my parents have come here, so we are not parted forever." He was not sure if she spoke to comfort herself or him, but her slight smile widened and her eyes glowed at him. "I am longing to see the sacred hill and the dwellings of the High King and all the great places of Tara. But marriage—" The bright eyes grew shadowed and the smile faded and the freckled face was apprehensive. Sisnan laid a hand on her head. "It will not be at once, little one. All things come gently and in time. You will be ready for it." Life was rising in the hall behind them, people stirring in the sleeping rooms along the wall, and women laying dishes on the small tables for the morning meal. Against the clatter, Macha stood in silence and watched, knowing in that moment that she would really be leaving him and the family of all the unthinking years of her happy childhood in this small dun above the cold, tumbling sea. "Oh, my father," she said then, and her voice was thin, and she laid her hand down on his breast in the honored gesture of long love and respect. A moment he stroked the soft red hair. "It will be well, my daughter," he said gently. "It will be well. Now I see that the meal is almost ready. The pots are on the table and the men are coming in. People gather about us. Go now to the Grian and find your foster mother, and tell her and the children your news." Blinking the sudden tears from her lashes, she turned obediently and left him, pausing in a moment to look back. "How long until I go?" she asked him. "Your father will come for you in about 14 days from now, and when the great spring festival is past Atar." She nodded and went on into the fresh sun where the sweet reek of turf rose from all the new lit fires around the dun, and the thin threads of smoke above them flickered in the small wind from the sea. At first, she walked abstracted, her head down, returning absently the morning greetings of the people of the dun. Then, gradually, a slow smile began to creep across her face, and the light brown eyes kindled into pleasure. Tara! Her foster family were very dear to her, but even though Sesnan was kinsman to her father, and also to the High King himself, he was only the chieftain of a small tribe, and his dun was neither large nor wealthy. But Tara, that would be quite different. And indeed, the more she thought about it, what was wrong with the idea of marriage and a household of her own in the green fields below the palace? Who would her father choose for her? There were so many whom it might be among the young nobles who lived in Tara. A warrior would be nice. She gave a little skip of pure excitement, and her long hair danced against her back, and by the time she reached the Grinen, or lady's bower, her freckled face was lost in sadness, and it was bright with pleasure in the future. She found it difficult to concentrate through the long morning of study and the afternoon of needlework, but in the end, it was over, and she was able to walk with Benet along the edges of the sea, dodging the tumbling waves of the high tide that foamed along the pale stretches of the sandy beach and surged up the mouth of the small river below the lowest walls of the dun. As there was peace this spring day, and no hint of threat, the bay gates in the lower palisades stood open, and the people came and went between the dun and the fishing village at the mouth of the river. Macha stood in the edges of the waves and snatched at her sandal strings, wanting to match her mood of excitement with the cold agony of the water rushing round her ankles and unstable and sliding away between her toes. "Benet," she shouted as she flung her shoes away. "Benet, are you sorry I'm to go away?" Benet was at this time a boy of 11, with the same mild, quiet face as his father. In the dun, they called him the Gentle One, for although he fought and tumbled with all the other boys and took full part in their warriors' games, he was never known to lose his temper, facing all his young life with an amiable smile and some strange, unchildlike steadfastness of character. He stood sunk up to his ankles in the soft white sand, with the wind trailing his brown hair across his face, and looked in silence at Macha, dancing in the foam. "Are you sorry I'm going, Benet?" she called again, lifting her voice against the wind and the crying of the gulls along the endless shore. He smiled at her then, and for a moment it was as if he were the older, standing there so quietly, with kindness in his eyes for the tousled girl capering in the sea, with her hair tattered by the wind and her skirts of saffron linen gathering damp and crumpled in her hands. "Wouldn't I be sorry," he said then, "if they said the sun wouldn't rise for me again after tomorrow, or some certain day? Wouldn't I weep at the thought of the darkness?" She stopped in her leaping over the waves and stood with the wet, icy sand crumpling underneath her feet, arrested by the strange formality of his words. Looking at him, she saw through her own excitement the clear sadness in his young face. Pity struck her, and she forgot her new importance, and her hands grew limp in her yellow skirts, trailing wet and dark in the water as she rushed out to him. "Oh, Benet, don't grieve for me like that. I will not be very far away. Even when I have a husband, you can visit me in my own household and see the wrath of the kings in Macha and the great banquet hall and all the splendors of the royal dun. You would enjoy that." Desperately, she peered close into his face, almost as if she had not seen him before, suddenly conscious of the unhappiness of his dark blue eyes under their black lashes. His sadness caught her, too, and she did not know how she would ever bring herself to leave any of them. Tears rose hot and thick to choke her throat in the spike in the edges of her lashes. Benet moved back a little to sit down in the cool, shifting sand above the sea. "Now I've made you unhappy, Macha," he said remorsefully, as she followed him and flopped down beside him, scrubbing the tears from her eyes with the edge of her cloak, her pale cheeks reddening with the rubbed salt of the spray. "I think I'm only jealous of you," he added. "Jealous?" Amazement widened her tawny eyes. "Why? Do you want to get married yourself? Men are not married as young as you. How could you keep a wife without land and cattle?" She looked at him as if she thought he had left his senses with the touch of a druid wisp, and Benet laughed out loud, clear and light in the wide wind, flinging himself back in the soft sand. He laughed again and shook his head, and his white, uneven teeth closed on his lower lip. "Oh no, Macha, I don't want to get married. Who would have me?" His face grew serious then, and Macha watched him, his eyes sad and distant as he stared out over the crested waters. "No, I am jealous because you know what you are going to do. You know what your life is for, and the rules are there for you to live by." Now the girl was utterly bewildered, staring at this Benet, who talked all of a sudden like an old man, the grave words odd and impossible from his round, childish face. "You will get married," he went on. "It is all laid down. You will marry some good man of your father's choosing and settle down in a dwelling at Tar and raise your family round you. It is all there. You have nothing to doubt or think about." Macha was truculent, bewildered, and upset by this strange, unchildlike boy whom she had never seen before. "Well, and what is wrong with that?" she demanded of him fiercely, eyeing him as though amazed that he could look the same as ever and yet talk such nonsense. Nothing. Don't be angry with me. I only said I think you're lucky. When I try to look into my future, I see nothing at all." The girl still stared at him, her wet skirts in her hand. What had gotten into him? She was impatient. "You have a future just as clear as mine. You are your father's son and will live to take his place and rule the tribe as he does now. You don't need me to tell you this," she added more gently. She wanted to reassure him, to use this old-looking, unhappy, face so that she herself could be happy again, as she had been before he spoke. But Benet rolled over on his face, grabbing at the soft sand and watching it pour out through his fingers. "I don't know what I want. I know nothing. I look into my future and it is like a thick cloud, like a druid augury by fire and smoke. But for me, the smoke clears to no picture. I see no picture, no future." Macha shivered suddenly in the bright day, touched unwillingly by his discontent. With no ideas what to say or how to deal with him, she stood up and made a great fuss of brushing the fine sand from her clothes and wringing the water from the ends of her skirts, glancing out over the sea in a desperate hope of something she could find to talk about. At once she straightened and forgot her clothes, staring out over the water. "Benet, a boat, a big one and a strange one, coming for the river mouth." Benet leapt to his feet. He was a boy again, his fears of the future forgotten, his face as old only as his 11 years. "Where?" "There," Macha pointed. "They are just lowering the sail." "Ah, I see her. They are getting out the sweeps to manage the tide in the mouth of the river. It is someone who knows his way in, but the boat is strange." They stood puzzled, watching the vessel as she made her way toward the small estuary of the river on the far side of the dun, coming easily on the green, white-crested springtime sea, her long oars dipping to the rising tide. "Mach, look at all the people in it." Benet drew closer to her. "What can it be? No trading vessel would have all those aboard her. And they're all in white," Macha answered in a while, as puzzled as he. "All in white clothes? Are they all druids? There's one who stands in the prow alone, and he has something which glitters round his brow." Even as he spoke, the declining sun struck a blaze of brilliance from the head of the small, solitary figure in the prow of the distant boat. Macha looked for her shoes. "Come, brother," she said. "We'll see what this is all about. It will reach the breaching just as we do if we run." The boy was off before her, ignoring the cries of his young sisters from the sand dunes, and side by side, he and Macha raced excitedly off along the sands towards the river, in the spot where the strange vessel could be expected to make landfall. Already, by the time they had skirted the lower walls of the duns, and the huts of the fisher people below it, and came to the river mouth, there was a crowd of people gathered. In murmured curiosity, they watched the boat that was now coming close inshore, her sweeps withdrawn, and her helmsman watching to beach her on the soft white sand below the harbor huts. Macha cut across towards them over the dying grounds, brushing aside the hanging nets, half noticing the smell of tar and fish sharp on the cooling wind, and realizing suddenly that Benet had come to a stop and she had left him far behind. "Come closer, Benet, come closer." She dodged backward and forward, her eyes darting between Benet and the boat, urging him near. "What strange people they are! We have never seen such before. Come nearer." In spite of all her urging, Benet stayed where he had stopped, apart from the curious crowd, silent and still on a small rise of the dunes, with his blue eyes wide on the men who now leapt out of the foaming shells from the high-sided, foreign-looking craft. The rough, long-bearded men of the village crowded close and stared at the strangers in amazement and suspicion. They muttered and wondered and drew back, and then crowded close again in their irresistible curiosity. The men from the sea all wore white robes, strange, loose garments that hung full above their trews, now darkened with the seawater at the first of them waded up onto the sand. They were smiling and friendly, speaking amiably in their own language to the crowd of astonished people on the shore. On a small sandhill, the boy Benet stood alone, bright and solitary in his blue tunic, his brown curls lifted to the wind and his wide, incredulous eyes resting only on the man who stood alone at the prow of the vessel. This man wore white like all the others, a one-piece garment that looked as though his cloak were taken and a hole cut for his head. About his brow rested a band of gold from which rose a flat blade like the head of an axe, splintering and glistening in the last light from the sun above the western hill. In his hand he held a tall, crooked-headed staff, braffed bright with the same sunlit gold, and at him, and him alone, did Benet look, watching steadily as one of the bigger men in the boat came to him and lifted him, carrying him dry-shod through the shallow water to the shore, and setting him down before the crowd. Not a very tall man, but strong and agile-looking, with a brown, weather-beaten face. The boy wondered why he had could not have climbed out like all the others and waded ashore from the beached boat. Macha rushed back to him and seized him by the arm, her pale face pink with excitement. What is he, that he cannot step into the sea like other men? Who are they? She could neither watch nor talk enough. Look, Benet, oh look, he is going to speak to us. The small one with the Adze on his brow. Is he the leader? Come on, Benet, what is wrong with you? When she pulled at his arm and he still refused to come, she gave him her attention for a moment, looking at his wide eyes and his rapt, astonished look. What is it? If they are strange, then come and see them. They are peaceful. They have no weapons. There is nothing to fear, Benet. I am not afraid. His voice was almost absent. Adze head, he said then. Oh, Macha, that is it. We are seeing a prophecy fulfilled. We are living the words of the Druids. You talk no sense. She was impatient and irritable at missing the excitement of hearing the man speak. But there was something strange in Benet's face that told her to have patience. And when he seized her in turn and began to race her towards the open gates of the dun, she came with him with only one last backwards glance. We must get my father, he cried as he ran. He will know of it. It was he who told me. The long, green eastern slopes of the hill were now in shadow, but the sun still struck golden from the west, lighting the brush-crowned tops of all the raths inside the dun, and every earthen wall in a late warm glow. The people were gathered, watching the distant scene below them on the shore. Who are they, and whence do they come? From their high walls, and the people leaned over and shouted to the running children, and Macha, full of her news, would have stopped to chatter, but the boy would have none of it, shaking his head and pounding on up the long, darkening slopes until he reached his father's own rath at the very top. Here Sesnin stood like all his people, on the watchman's ramparts of the wall, his wife and children at his side, staring with the others through the gathering dusk. Benet was too breathless for the last climb up the wooden ladder. He stood at the bottom and held to the rough timber of the rails and gasped for his breath. My father, he managed to shout at last, and only then did Macha come panting up beside him. His soft, sun-flushed face was white, and his hair was curled tight around his hot, damp forehead. Sesnin came, and he looked down on him in silence and waited for him to speak. My father, he shouted, and it was as though in the clear green evening the whole dun fell silent with his father to hear what he had to say. Only a solitary blackbird piped of spring from the elms beyond the hall. My father, have you seen them? I have seen them. Father and son looked at each other, and the girl looked from one to the other with some sense that what they had said was of desperate importance, some unhappy and yet excited certainty that from this urgent moment on the wrath of Sinsen, nothing would ever be the same again. Tell me again, father, cried Benet, and his young voice rang like a bell in the clear silence. What was it the Druid said? I have forgotten. Tell me the prophecy. He pushed back the sweat-damp hair from his forehead and watched his father, who turned from him a moment and looked down at the shadowy figures by the sea, and then turned back. His face had the same stunned look of settled amazement on his son's. Slowly and clearly, Sesnin spoke, and from all the higher raths in the dun, astonished faces lifted themselves, ghost-white, to listen. Adze's head will come, over the mad crest sea, his cloak whole-headed, his staff crook-headed, his table in the east of his house. He will chant impiety from his table, and all his household will respond, Amen, Amen. There was a long silence when he stopped, with no sound but the wind in the trees along the crest of the hill, and the far murmur of the sea, and the higher, urgent murmur of the crowd below them on the beach. Through it, father and son still looked at each other. Go down, my son, said Sesnin at last. His voice was quiet now, carrying through the stillness. Go down and bid him welcome in my name. Bid them all welcome, and bring them all up to my house. This concludes chapter 1.